This day started like any other, but soon turned into a nightmare I couldn't even imagine in my worst dreams. I was standing in the kitchen, making myself coffee, when the phone rang. At that moment, I didn't know that this call would turn my whole life upside down. The voice on the other end was a doctor from the local hospital. His words were sharp and merciless. "Your wife has been in an accident. We did everything we could, but unfortunately she passed away." The world around me collapsed. I stood still, feeling my soul being emptied, as if it had been sucked out, leaving only an empty shell. I had no tears, no emotions, just a cold, bottomless void. The doctors told me they had fought for her life for a long time, but couldn't save her. Meanwhile, I had barely been hurt in the accident, and that thought tormented me. Why her, and not me? What did I do to deserve this? In that moment, I began to blame myself, and that feeling of guilt became my constant companion. The funeral was bleak and sorrowful. I stood by the coffin, looking at her lifeless face, feeling everything inside me crumbling. Relatives and friends tried to comfort me, but their words didn't reach my consciousness. The only thing I felt was unbearable pain and loss. I couldn't stay in our house, where every object reminded me of her. Every corner, every trifle was permeated with her presence, and it was unbearable. Deciding that moving would help me cope with the loss, I found a small apartment on the other side of the city. The new place was modest and lacked the memories that haunted me in our house. The first weeks after the move were difficult. I hardly left the apartment, couldn't eat or sleep. Every night was filled with nightmares, in which I relived the moment I learned of her death. But gradually, life began to return to normal. I found a job, made new acquaintances. Though the pain of loss didn't disappear, it became slightly less acute. I began to believe that maybe I could go on living. But this calm turned out to be deceptive. One evening, as I was getting ready for bed, there was a loud knock on the door. I startled, not expecting visitors at such an hour. Approaching the door, I looked through the peephole, but saw only darkness. Thoughts of burglary or unwelcome guests raced through my mind. "Who's there?" I asked, trying to keep my voice from trembling. The answer I heard made my heart stop. It was my wife's voice. It sounded soft but confident, as if she were standing right behind the door. My blood ran cold and cold sweat broke out on my forehead. I was sure I was going crazy. "This can't be," I repeated to myself. "She's dead." I didn't know what to think. Maybe the doctors were wrong, maybe she was really alive. But then how did she find my new address? Why didn't she let me know earlier? Doubt and fear tormented me, paralyzing my will. I couldn't bring myself to open the door. She knocked for a long time, repeating her plea, but I stood there, unable to move. With the first rays of sunlight, everything quieted down. I spent the day in confusion, trying to understand what had happened the night before. Maybe it was just a nightmare born from my exhausted mind. But everything seemed so real. The day stretched on endlessly. Every minute I returned in thought to this strange event. When evening came again, I felt the tension inside me growing. I couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was about to happen. And indeed, soon there was a new knock. This time it was much stronger, as if someone were pounding on the door with such force that it would soon come off its hinges. I approached the door, but this time I didn't look through the peephole. My wife's voice sounded again, but now it was full of ominous hatred and despair. It sounded as if it came from the depths of hell. The door shook under the blows, as if someone were trying to break in. I felt my ears ringing with fear, goosebumps running over my body, and I began to tremble. I realized it couldn't be my wife. It was something else, something sinister, taking on her appearance and that voice. It penetrated to the depths of my soul, causing unbearable pain. A strong blow tore the door off its hinges, and it entered. The creature that was once my wife stood before me. Her skin was deathly pale, her eyes burning with red fire. Her head turned 360 degrees, and sharp, blade-like teeth protruded from her mouth. It lunged at me, and I realized I couldn't resist. She pounced on me with inhuman strength. I felt her cold hands gripping me, and in that moment I knew I couldn't resist. Deep down, I knew I didn't deserve to live when my wife was dead. Guilt and fear consumed me, leaving only the awareness of an inevitable end. At that moment, I realized I didn't deserve to live when my wife was dead. I stood, paralyzed with horror and guilt, letting this creature come closer. It grabbed me with its icy hands, and I felt life slipping away from me. The light began to fade, and I realized I was leaving this world to be reunited with her in eternity. Guilt and fear disappeared, leaving only coldness and emptiness. In this silent nightmare, I understood that the worst thing to lose is not life, but hope. This creature came for me to take me into the darkness, where I would forever remain a prisoner of my fear and guilt.